How do you beat India at home? Well, it's a question I've been asking for about a year and a half on this site and my other sites, podcasts, and you get asked on things. Analysts from various teams around the world have contacted me occasionally and think, do you have any thoughts? And the issue, of course, is that they have so many of the world's best spinners, and so many of their spinners can also bat. It means that they have this batting order that never ends. So even if you do manage to occasionally get rid of their top order, maybe even more than occasionally, they still make extra runs all the way through. And if it's a flat pitch, they have the world's best flat pitch seamer and their batters make a whole ton of runs. Plus, they have many other highly skilled bowling options when it comes to spin and pace available to them at all times. And they have batting styles now and of the future that are overlapping. Not to mention that they decided a few years ago that they were going to make pitches that were going to accentuate their strength as well, of just spinning the ball as much as possible. The truth is that for 18 series and 4,331 days, no one really had any answers to this. And it was a fair and valid question. They had more home wins in a row than the Great Australian and the Great West Indian sides ever managed. It was absolutely incredible. And when we all thought about this and used our collective brain power to wonder how someone would actually beat India at home, not a single one of us thought that it would be Tim Saily outscoring India in a first innings and Mitchell Santner taking 13 wickets to outbowl Ashwin and Jadeja. In the history of cricket, there are really not many bigger upsets than what we have seen. It might even be very, very close to the top. And in a lifetime of punching above their weight, the Kiwis just jumped up into the sky and punched a star. As a cricket journalist, I would travel sometimes up to 200 days a year. I loved watching cricket games. I loved going to new countries. It was an absolute dream. But there was one thing I hated more than anything else about it, and it was this little pin. The thing that I need to change my SIM card in every new country. The absolute worst thing about this pin and SIM cards is when I was traveling to the West Indies, of having to arrive in every new island or country and having to work out if I could still find this pin and then line up and get my SIM card in every single airport. Well, now we have the answer thanks to Saily. They can make it so you never have to worry about this nonsense ever again. They use an eSIM app that once you install once, it is easy, simple, and cheap. Oh, and it works in more than 160 countries. And you can throw these pins away forever, because now you just need to download the Saily app before your trip. And if you do it with our code, GOODAREAS, you get an exclusive 15% discount on Saily eSIM data plans. So before your next holiday or work trip or any time you have to travel to another country, download the Saily app and use the code GOODAREAS, or one word, at checkout, and you can travel like a pro with Saily. You know, all I could think about today when watching New Zealand absolutely pummel India in conditions where there was a little bit in the wicket, certainly for spinners and everything else, is Bangladesh has a much better side that is actually set up to come over and beat India in India on this kind of wicket. Like, they have all-round talent. They had 5 genuine frontline bowlers to choose from. They have a lot of players who play spin. They have some weaknesses as well, but they also have some good pace bowling. Like, there was a lot to like about that Bangladesh side. And they got absolutely slapped around. So much so, but by the last test, people were saying Bangladesh should never come to India again. Absolutely, what is the point of Bangladesh? Because India produced a result in a way that we've never really seen any team do before. And you look at that Bangladesh team on paper, and you look at this New Zealand team on paper, and there is no doubt which one is better at playing spin, better at bowling spin, and was more set up for India, and yet none of it mattered. Bangladesh was horrible. New Zealand have already won this series. And forget just the starting 11s, what about some of the other circumstances? New Zealand decided to make this an Asian tour. That they were going to play Afghanistan and India, then they were going to Sri Lanka, and then hopefully by the end of that, they'd be a lot better for when they were playing against India. That made a lot of sense, but the first game they got to, well, it was just an ounce of rain seemed to flood the ground for days, and the fans that people put onto the ground just didn't cut it. Then they get to Sri Lanka and they put themselves in a couple of good positions in the first test. Sri Lanka just completely overwhelmed them in the end. In fact, they weren't even really all that much in that series. And so by the time they got to India, how would anyone in the world think that they had a chance? Well, I still haven't met anyone who thought they had a chance of winning a test, let alone the series. And that's because when you start to look at all the things that were stacked up against New Zealand, it's hard to see how they were going to. For instance, Kane Williamson was not going to be playing to start the series. He is undoubtedly, I would say, the greatest batter that New Zealand has ever produced. While the rest of their batting has been pretty poor over the last 18 months to 2 years, Kane Williamson has been absolutely incredible. You would think that he would be very important in India, but New Zealand absolutely did not need their greatest batter ever to do this upset. Tim Southee, a fantastic bowler, and specifically someone who can take advantage of the SG balls very early on when they swing around. The problem there being that Tim Southee's recent form was so bad, well, not only people were saying he shouldn't be in the team anymore, and there was probably some justification for that, but also he gave up the captaincy, like he knew what was coming as well. Tom Latham also hasn't made a lot of runs of recent times and was suddenly made new captain. And remember, think about all the planning New Zealand had done for this series and what they wanted to do, and then halfway through the series they just had to give the captaincy to another player, and someone who wasn't in great form himself. And it wasn't the only form issue. Devon Conway burst like a shining star onto Test cricket. And the last couple of years, he's, not been shining and not so much of a star. Rachin Ravindra, we all know how good he can be, and we all know how good he should be. But he hadn't quite done much in Test cricket other than a very big innings against the South 11, the South African D team from a little while back. Daryl Mitchell, Tom Blundell, absolutely starring for a couple of years, and they've both just gone into huge form funks. And even if you think about their strength over the last couple of years, which has been seam bowling, well, Tim Southee had already lost form, Trent Bolt was off with a contract, Neil Wagner had retired, we haven't seen Kyle Jamieson in a while, Ben Sears is supposed to be really good, he's not here as well. They didn't even have all of their options available to them. And they went in that first test and the toss was lost. If it had been won, well, Tom Latham said he was going to have a bat. Like, everything went their way at that point. And what they had left of their bowlers was Will O'Rourke, who everyone thought was really exciting, but we weren't quite sure how it was going to translate to India. Tim Southee, who was on an incredible downward curve, and Matt Henry, who has never played 3 tests in a row in his entire career. And he absolutely blitzes. In fact, all the seamers bowl brilliantly, and they win that test, even though there is at times a huge comeback. And who makes the runs? Conway and Ravindra. Again, no one could have seen any of that coming. But the conditions did go in their favor and they got hugely ahead of that game, and even though they almost gave it back, they fought their way back and played very well. And so what happens for the next test? Matt Henry is not available, and Michael Bracewell, the most logical choice to bring in as their second spinner, is going home because he's about to have a child. Like, even when things went their way, they still went against them straight afterwards. And of course, they're going to go to Pune, and everyone knows it's going to spin. We remember the Steve O'Keefe match. We've seen the ball spin there before. And that's okay, because they have Ajaz Patel. And shall we just have a look at Ajaz Patel's stats over the first couple of tests? He took all 10 wickets in an innings the last time he came to India. In 2 tests so far, he has 4 wickets. Essentially, on paper, if we're being honest here, their second best spinner is a former wicketkeeper who just bowls because he gets really, really bored and wants to be involved in everything. And how do you win in Pune if Ajaz Patel isn't taking any wickets, if you have to rely way too much on Glenn Phillips, and you come from a nation where you've never really made that much runs against the spinning ball, and you've never really taken that many wickets with the spinning ball? In fact, in the entire history of New Zealand cricket, they had won 2 tests in India. And I would say that of the most established sides in world cricket, you would have to say that New Zealand is by far and away the worst when it comes to Asian conditions. They've just never had the right team for that. And Pune is quintessential Asian conditions. And they're trying to do that with Ajaz Patel, who seems incredibly low in confidence, and Glenn Phillips, who has too much confidence, but maybe that is going to get him through with a couple of wickets. And of course, they could take something from that first test, but we do know that India lose first test and the conditions were in their favor. This was the one where that was not the case. And so the spinner that they choose is Mitch Santner. And you will hear a lot about how he averaged 42 in Test cricket before this. It is very, very, very important to remember that he also averaged 42 in first-class cricket before this. Mitch Santner had never had success with the red ball. He had 54 wickets in Test cricket coming in here. And he has ended up with 13 wickets. 13 wickets. To a man who has never shown any inkling that this was about to happen. He's 32. His prime has been around for 4 years. He has experience. He's traveled around the world. We know specifically how bad he has been in Asia. And he just drops the 13 wickets on India, allowing for basically a run out and a couple of other wickets. And that is all New Zealand need to take all 20. And so Mitch Santner has ended up with more wickets in this match than Ashwin and Jadeja have combined over 2 tests. And it gets even weirder when you think about India, because they dropped their third spinner and they overlooked Akshar Patel, and they brought in someone else who was more of a risk. And he put in what most people would normally get a Player of the Match award for. And yet they still lost the game. The pitch spun consistently all the way through. It helped tall spinners specifically, and India had 2, New Zealand only had 1. And essentially, when it came down to it, Mitch Santner took almost all of New Zealand's most crucial wickets all the way through this game. And Ashwin and Jadeja could not, even though Washington played well above what anyone would have ever imagined he could do. I don't know what to do with any of this. It's completely and utterly bizarre. And I studied the history of cricket. Look at what's happened recently. There have been so many incredible upsets. The West Indies women against the England women, I think, is probably one that almost isn't mentioned anymore. The South African women in the semi-final, absolutely incredible. Bangladesh men against Pakistan. What an occasion for cricket that was. What about Pakistan's series? That has happened at the same time, on the same day. Pakistan were obliterated off the face of the map in the first test match. And yet, they have come back and played one of the great comeback series we have ever seen in Test cricket. And no one cares, because it's barely a blip compared to what New Zealand did against a team who has been winning consistently at home for 4,000 days. And you go through the history of our game and you start to look for the best upsets of all time. Sri Lanka in South Africa in 2019 and in England in 2014 comes to mind. I think they're both brilliant. I'm not sure they're better than this, in part because they weren't playing a team of this quality. Even if India didn't play up to their best, you still had to beat India. I go back to ye olde series like India and England in 1971. It's like when India beat England all those years back in their first ever win. And I don't know how to map all these things, but the one thing I know is we have seen massive upsets before. Quite often it happens in one-off games, and I think we can all accept that as fans as an occasional thing that happens in cricket. But when you have a side as dominant as India have been, think about Australia and the West Indies. If you were old enough to be around for either of those reigns, how bizarre it would have been if a team in transition who had won 8 of their previous 23 matches without their best bat, without a first choice spinner, and with the bowler who actually set up the first win not even being fit for the second game, would just walk into a fortress and just take a victory from one of those sides in 2 consecutive test matches. There's no way we can even comprehend that. And that is what New Zealand have done. They are nowhere near the best team in world cricket anymore. They are a side barely holding on since their World Test Championship victory, right? And yet then they come out and they do this, the thing that no other teams could do. It's ludicrous. And of course, then it makes me think about the most important wins in New Zealand history. Forget the best upsets or anything else, but just the ones that really, really matter. You've got their first test series away from home in Pakistan back in 1969. You've got the Women's T20 World Cup and the Women's ODI title in 2000. And of course, this series in India. And I don't know right at the moment how to rank any of those because I've still got so much Mitch Santner taking wickets in my brain that I can't process anything else. But what I would say is this. I've just gone through the most important moments in New Zealand cricket history, and 2 of them have come in a week. And both with teams who looked completely done, toasted, washed. That Women's World Cup team, when they came in, it was like, this is not a side that can win this tournament. They are losing again and again and again and again and again. And this men's team, they turned up and they didn't even trouble that side. How the hell are you going to go from losing in Sri Lanka to smashing India? Not beating them, smashing them. I think the odds of one of these wins was probably 50-1. Imagine you put a single dollar on the fact that both of them would happen. You would be incredibly rich. You may not have to work for the next 5 years of your life. So, I don't know. New Zealand beat the world and India within a week. And honestly, I still don't know how. I'm not sure I fully have processed the women winning, and the men on top of that is just too much for my brain to even take. So, how do you beat India in India? Imagine the template being Tim Southee making runs and Mitch Santner taking all your wickets. So, the answer is, I still don't know. For some reason or another, there was a narrative around for a long time that India always choked in the big moments and under pressure. Well, this series wasn't that, right? No one had this down as even a remote possibility of happening. When it comes down to it, this series wasn't supposed to be remembered in history. We were not supposed to have a test that we remembered as the Mitch Santner test. We were not supposed to have a match where India were 350 runs down after a single innings. We were not supposed to have any of it. And I suppose if you think about the history of New Zealand cricket, it is rising up as a collective and punching a bigger team in the mouth. Well, in this case, you don't get much bigger than India in India.
I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.